So don't forget, don't leave anything blank. Go back. Oh, what time do you have to be at the, what's the hotel again? The DoubleTree. Start today. So you better be there between 7:30 and 7:45. The earlier you're there, the earlier they can get the things handed out, and then you are done. Don't be that person who shows up at 8:15 and everyone glares at you. Don't be that person. So get there on time so you get started. And you need pencils and blue or black pen. And that's, I said pencils and blue or black pens. Bring a few extra, please. No, there's nothing more fun than halfway through the essay, your pen goes out and you realize your other pen goes, or you don't have one. So bring a couple extra. And don't forget that we're going to have a choice of short answer questions. 4 choices, you must answer 3. Each one has 3 parts, but you put it all in one block paragraph. No topic sentence. Each one is a short ID. You pick your topic. You pick it what you know. 1 sentence explain it, 1 sentence example, 1 sentence what it led to. And if you have nothing it led to, what led to it? It's best to see what's going on, but be connected, related to something else. That's the key element. Then you have a DBQ. How many documents must you use? 6 documents. That's how many per paragraph on average? 2 per body paragraph. If you have the time, hedge your bets, do 1 more. For 3 of them, you must do you must explain why they have that point of view, what they call have. White believes this because of some event, some idea, some philosophy. For 3 of them. You get no choices on that one, but it would be something, I don't know, something from the events leading to the Revolutionary War up till we're going to finish after that. And also, lastly, not a big, I know they're generally pretty broad, but like I said, I can't. And then essay questions, you get 3 choices, you answer 1. Now tomorrow is going to be weird because we have a 15-minute online assembly, I guess. I don't know if that's going to cut in the second period. I'm not really sure. They said about 3 different schedules. So we'll just play it by ear and go. All right. So we got to the Cuban Missile Crisis. We got From the Brink. We got that. Did we get to this limited? So but we got to, they agreed to pull the missiles out, right? We got to this. So they pulled that. I mean, literally the edge of nuclear war. But I got to be very clear about it. Khrushchev was humiliated. And even though Kennedy's stature went up, his popularity is actually going to go down a lot the next year. And so from the brink, they would do a limited test ban treaty and also set up a hotline. Hotline is direct communication between the Kremlin and the White House. Part of the deal had to be actually broadcast over Radio Moscow and then deciphered and sent. It was just a train wreck. But this hotline was a telegraph line at first that would do Morse code. It wasn't a phone. You're watching a movie, it'd always be like a red phone. And so this idea that they put the nuclear monster back to rest. But this threat is going to be for the rest of the decade. And China had just exploded their first nuclear weapon. So all the decisions that are coming up in the next decade about, let's say, a war in Vietnam will be about, we don't want this to go into World War III. And so with that, but ironically, now this is what we got to get down. On your, if you have your review packet, get it turned to the last page. Because this is the biggest reason why the Soviet Union collapsed. Khrushchev is going to be ousted, 1964. Basically, they'll put him into forced retirement. And a bunch of hardliners are going to take over. And the Soviets will vow never to be humiliated again. And they're going to start a massive arms buildup. In fact, 50% of their entire economy by the 1970s will be purely for weapons. Remember, weapons don't build anything. So it's going to lead to massive shortages in the Soviet Union, and they already had shortages. In the 80s, they had an absolute economic collapse. It just fell apart. And then in 1989, in the midst of this, trying to do this, there was, end of the Cold War.
Oh.
End of the Cold War. Sorry, I didn't say that. End of the Cold War. The Cold War ended shockingly fast because attempts at reform, if you look at the guy across from it, Mikhail Gorbachev tried to reform the Soviet Union with an attempt to have some kind of arms control. It just devastated the Soviet economy and collapsed, and the Soviet Union itself fell in 1991. And so in the 1980s, they actually the military-industrial complex greatly exaggerated the power of the Soviet Union when they were literally in free fall. Here are Soviet surface-to-air missiles out to the ICBM, and this is Leonid Brezhnev, who would become the leader of the Soviet Union. This is my vision of the Soviet Union, was this man. It's hard to get away from the eyebrows. Yes, the Soviet Union in World War II started really liking metals. All the way down. So, but it's going to take a while. Now, the Warren Court. In your packet, the Warren Court is on there, and the Warren Court will be on page 10. You see it right below Freedom Riders, the Warren Court. And Earl Warren, the Republican governor of California, was picked by Eisenhower to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And this would turn out to be the most, what they would call, liberal or pro-civil rights Supreme Court in American history. Everything from the rights to those accused of crime to civil rights are going to come out of the Warren Court. In fact, some of the most important rulings, which we'll get to in just a second, that's Earl Warren right there. Eisenhower was quite surprised. And so this is the court that just took power when a series of cases were winding their way. But partially because of, look a little bit further above, you'll see Emmett Till. Now, Emmett Till his family went to Chicago during the Great Migration. I didn't put the years, I did, 1953. He was 13. And he went down, the arrow was I was going to put MS for Mississippi, and I forgot to write that down. He went down to Mississippi to visit family in the very segregated South. Now, Chicago was pretty segregated, but certainly more freedoms than in the South. He went down there. Nobody's exactly sure what happened, but the justification would be that he supposedly said something inappropriate to a woman who was running a grocery store in this little tiny town called Money, Mississippi. Her husband and brother took Emmett Till out and tortured him to death. And they were acquitted. The trial took no time at all. Given the majority of the population around there were African Americans, of course, they were all white men. And this is the trial, and they were acquitted. Now, there have been so many lynchings. We've mentioned this before. What made this different was it was 1953. There was a new media, especially television, and this hit the national news and exposed to everybody this horrible lie outside of the South, or exposed to people who were not black. Fox knew this was going on all over. They knew. They fled it when they went to the Great Migration. This was happening. But all of a sudden, everybody else in the United States could not escape this. So this exposed it in the national news and also embarrassed the United States in the Cold War. Emmett Till just exploded. And this is going to help trigger what we're going to call the movement next door, the civil rights movement, or the movement. This will help trigger it. But the big trigger of the movement and the best example, and when Martin Luther King would hit the stage, will be the Birmingham Bus Riots. Bus boycott. What happened was this. Rosa Parks was part of a wide movement by a number of different groups to protest Jim Crow laws. And she decided on December 1st, 1955, that she was not going to get out of her seat. The front few seats of these buses most of the buses in Birmingham were ridden by African Americans. They couldn't afford cars, and they had to get from their segregated neighborhoods to white neighborhoods to work. The first couple seats were whites. The next few were for, they put down colored, which is a very insulting name too. But they called it that. But the driver could kick those people out if the white seats were filled. And that's what happened. She was in the front, that she's recreating it right there. And she refused to give up her seat. She basically, it was, they've been planning it. They tried with somebody else already, a young woman named Claudia Colvin, but it didn't get the reaction they hoped. And she just decided on that day, I'm doing this. And the big thing was, she was arrested. Normally, they just intimidated. She was arrested. And by arrested, they could go to court. And then, for a year, Black riders boycotted the buses to force the end of Jim Crow laws. And coming on the stage would be a very young Martin Luther King. He was such a young man. He was in his 20s. Here he is behind Rosa Parks right here. And that's when he would come onto the stage. Eventually, the Supreme Court would rule that segregated buses were unconstitutional. They chipped away at Jim Crow laws, segregated buses. So it wasn't this it could have the opportunity to overturn things. Trust me, the Supreme Court today would overturn the whole thing. Of course, they would probably go down. And that leads to another very important court case, and one of the most important of the Warren Court. Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education. So this is the Warren Court. And this would be to forcibly integrate, or at least end segregated schools. There were segregated black and white schools. Actually, in poor neighborhoods, both schools were horrible, but white students could at least say, well, I got my own school, I have this. Remember Bacon's Rebellion thinking. It overturned, at least for school, Plessy versus Ferguson. That's separate versus equal. That's why I have a line through it. In fact, the Supreme Court said they are inherently unequal. Why? The only reason they're segregated was racism. And by definition, that's unequal. Now, there's lots of reasons why that. Remember Bacon's Rebellion. Divide the people on the bottom. Keep the same power structure. Well, it's going to be a couple years. And this is going to be protests. This is one of the protests. This one is in Louisville, Kentucky against this. Race mixing, it's hard to see it, but it's communism. And the first school district in the former Confederacy would be Little Rock, Arkansas. And they purposely picked a working class, relatively poor school because they know the students there would see this as a direct threat on their status. Remember, they don't have much. Their expectation is for a hard life where they'll work very hard and probably not a lot of wealth. They don't have much, but what's the one thing they have? Remember Bacon's Rebellion. It divided people. Don't have much, but we're white. And so this working class school went back to that Bacon's. We're going to see this time after time after time in history, the Bacon's thinking. And so here they picked 9 students. This was going to be just like, oh, we don't want to offend them much. We're just going to gently do it. Going to be called the Little Rock 9. Governor Orville Faubus, right here of Arkansas, he immediately saw political advantage of this. If I come out against this, I'll get a lot of support from white voters. And so he actually sent out the National Guard to stop them from coming in. What happened then? Eisenhower begged him. Eisenhower was no friend to civil rights, but Eisenhower was like, this is federal law now. You have to allow them in. Faubus refused. And so Eisenhower, in a fury, sent the 101st Airborne Division, an elite unit of the United States Army, to enforce immigration. Now you can imagine what's going to happen. The South say this is going to be in Reconstruction, guns force integration, and they would escort troops And then eventually the National Guard after they left with the 101st Airborne. These are the 9 students. And William Brown was right there. He would graduate. Is that it? Yeah, he would graduate from that year. But it'd be very slow integration, and almost immediately, you're going to see a movement of white students going to private schools. They literally call them segregation academies. Immediately separated. They gave them a name. And have you heard of charter schools? That's where it comes from this phenomenon. But that's another story from down the road. By the way, did this work for Faubus politically? Yeah, he'd be reelected another 9 times. They had 2-year terms. And you can imagine people are looking at this. We come out against civil rights. This could be a political advantage. And that is where we get the movement. And we will see this in Little Rock. We'll see this in other places, the movement. And the movement would be for the first about 9 years of the civil rights movement and would focus on the idea of civil disobedience. And Martin Luther King would come to represent this. No, he did not invent it, but he came to represent it. Now, this is direct action. This is protest. It shows a great amount of courage, but the job is to disobey unjust laws. And King was adamant that it had to be nonviolent. Don't give them an excuse to attack you. You be the ones who are being attacked. That takes a lot of guts. It would begin to blow up in the mid-1960s. 2 good examples of this are going to be sit-ins, to literally go into segregated restaurants and sit and demand to be served and take cat calls or drinks poured on you, etc. Or the same thing on buses through the South, segregated buses, the Freedom Riders. And they would be brutally attacked in Birmingham, Alabama, but take it. It takes a lot of courage for this. I'm going through this very quickly. But what King wanted was a morality. Good versus evil. Who are the just ones? If you're going to disobey just laws, who are the just ones? The ones who are just simply demanding to take part in the normal commerce of a capitalist economy, or those who are dumping drinks on? Who's morally right? But if there's violence in this, then it can be turned against you. So while that's going on, Kennedy's president. None of the new frontier is passing. And the civil rights movement begins to push him. And that's what we lead to the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This was organized by labor unions. And even though Martin Luther King would give probably the most famous speech, even though everyone forgets the main elements of the speech, this was to push Kennedy because Kennedy proposed civil rights bill, but it was dead in Congress. Now, this was also to push the Democrats to do what they promised to do. But the Democrats are bitterly divided over this. Republicans are becoming divided over this too. And the main element is economic justice. Must get rid of segregation and segregated workplaces and segregated restaurants and segregated commerce to demand equal pay and a better life. Oh, and a big one would say end segregated housing, which would not end until 1968. And so hundreds of thousands of people would come at the mall. There'd be 15 speakers. Labor unions are very much involved. Martin Luther King's speech very much attacked segregation, Jim Crow laws, demanded equal rights, demanded equal justice. And then he went away from the speech and riffed a riff he had done a lot, where he also had his vision of a future beyond segregation and equal rights. And that's why this would be called the I Have a Dream speech, which is actually kind of amusing because the people who are with him are like, oh God, he's on this riff again. We've heard this 100 times. It's really funny. They're like, geez, this thing again. Everyone else would be inspired, but they would forget the economic justice part and not realizing that he said this is going to be a horrible, long fight. In fact, 2 years after this, he would call it's no longer a dream, what the reality is in life. That's what he will say. Especially after civil rights stalled in 1967, 68. And that would be the only part of the speech people remember. Kennedy was actually kind of mad, but at the same time going, wow, that was a good speech. But Kennedy didn't like being pushed by this. So there would be a huge conservative backlash. And this is going to be the beginnings of a conservative backlash that would eventually explode in the late 1970s against King. You'll see this. These posters would be all over the South, these billboards. King was at, this is actually, wow. He is just at a meeting after the Birmingham Bus Riots, and they say this is communist training school. It was not communist training school. And here was the March on Washington, a public opinion poll after the March on Washington, and 60% of the American public was unfavorable. There was a big, they're going too far, too fast. Too fast. Of course, that's easy to say to people who don't have rights. And while this is going on, South Vietnam is blowing up. Kennedy looks at this and like, if South Vietnam falls, I'll be hammered. And that's where we get to Kennedy's reason for the war. It was not going well. So he kept committing, and eventually nearly 20,000 American advisors. Why? What are the reasons? Well, the domino theory. Also, Berlin. Remember Berlin? We vowed to defend Berlin. We better defend South Vietnam, which of course they have nothing to do in common. And he felt he had to look tough on communism. He was being hammered by civil rights. People who wanted it were mad that nothing happened, and people who were opposed were blaming him for marches and protests. And so he thought, I have to divert and look tough on communism. But now he made it important for the 1963 election. But Vietnam was falling apart. Its dictator, Nguyen Diem, was corrupt, giving jobs to family members. The army was taking money, officers were pocketing it, and the men weren't paid and deserting. And a series of protests began in South Vietnam, where Buddhist monks, to protest the corruption of the Diem administration, began to light themselves on fire in the streets of South Vietnam. And these would become some of the most famous shots of them committing suicide to try to bring people to pay attention to Diem. Now, I can't even wrap my mind around the horrors of this, except for this is falling apart. And Kennedy, they're worried South Vietnam might fall and Vietnam unified by 64. And so when some generals approach the United States and say, we want to overthrow Diem, they do it. Diem is murdered. This is October 63. But the problem is this now. We're stuck with the military in charge, military dictatorships. So it's going to be hard to say we're fighting for democracy when it's going to be one military dictatorship after another. For a while for 3 years, there was a coup almost every 6 months. And we're just stuck with them. A similar thing is going to happen in Afghanistan in your lifetime. We're going to be stuck with very corrupt government that the people don't like. But we have no choice but to back them up because they're our government. It's a nasty situation. We don't know what Kennedy would have done. Kennedy wanted to make it look like things were going well in South Vietnam. But politically, this was his worst time. In fact, he went to Dallas on the campaign swing because he needed Texas to be reelected. And what's going to happen a month after this? He's assassinated. November 22nd, 1963. A devout communist, desperate for attention, who tried to defect to the Soviet Union and Cuba. He actually lived in the Soviet Union for a year. Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President Kennedy. There's Oswald. He killed a police officer and then tried to kill another one. And they kind of, so there was a tussle. So he's pretty much roughed up in that picture. Here he is holding the rifle that killed President Kennedy. He's also holding a communist newspaper. On the back, he sounded Hunter a fascist. He believed Kennedy was a fascist. And that's kind of interesting because there are people protesting Kennedy in Dallas saying Kennedy was a communist. What an amazing time. Wow. 2 days afterwards, though, a strip club owner named Jack Ruby assassinated Oswald. And this was on television. They were broadcasting this, kind of going back and forth between Kennedy's body on its way to be laid in state at the Capitol and the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters where they're going to transfer Oswald. They kept going back and forth because it was delayed about an hour and a half. And Jack Ruby darted out. Kind of a series of mishaps got into the library or the garage and murdered him. That's just before he shot Oswald. This was all on television. It was broadcast. People watched this live. Yes. No. Put one bullet right here. He's only about 2 feet away. And I know, but yeah, it's kind of amazing. Oswald died right there. And Ruby thought he was going to be a hero. Just assume I'd kill the assassin. I'd be like treated like a hero. He would be arrested. He'd die in prison. But this made it seem very weird. And even though the evidence was overwhelming against Oswald, like, wow, what happened? The new president would do what's called the Warren Commission after Chief Justice Warren would lead it, even though he had little to do with it. And they investigated, thousands of investigators looked into it. They wanted to make sure, they wanted to prove it wasn't the Russians. They didn't want World War III. And they would decide Oswald acted alone. But by the late 1960s, after lies about Vietnam and other things began to come out, people began to believe there was a government cover-up. And the majority of the population by the 1990s, in fact, there's over 70% in some polls, believed the US government was behind the assassination, CIA or somebody like that. And today, it's still a majority of the population. Now, I've got to be very clear. There's never been even a smidgen of evidence that it was anybody other than Oswald. But it is rather odd. There's a few things, but the big thing is Ruby. But people like conspiracy theories a lot. So LBJ is the new president. And Lyndon Johnson, who hated being vice president, now is going to finish the New Deal and the New Frontier. And I love this picture. Here's LBJ when he was first elected to the House of Representatives, shaking hands with Franklin Roosevelt, his idol. And he was a Southern Democrat, a Texan. And he was going to pass the Northern Liberal program. And he called it the Great Society. And the Great Society will be this massive program of civil rights. And then a war on poverty, which is kind of almost unimaginable. Well, kind of unimaginable. Now, a war on poverty. The poverty rate was about 25%. And it would be very successful. Poverty would go down below 10%. It would go back up to about 16% by 2006. But it would do things like financial aid for college, expanding things like food stamps, Head Start, which would be child care for people, things like that. Not complete. It was just, there'd be over 1,000 bills passed. But also cultural growth, money for the arts, money for humanities, money for national parks. This was going to be a massive program. This is still at a time where the Americans thought we could do great things, not be constrained by things. I should add, poverty had dropped by almost a half in 2021. By almost a half. By the anti-COVID bill passed, they sent the child tax credit of $200 to $300 to every parent per child. And poverty dropped in half. But they let it lapse in January, and poverty is skyrocketing. That's why I say we could have done it. They didn't do it. So that's him announcing at the University of Michigan. The biggest one would be the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And it would have to go through over a 60-day filibuster where Southerners did everything they could to stop this. Southern Democrats did everything from reading the phone book on the floor of the United States Senate to their grandma's recipe to stifle debate. But after 60 days, they pushed it through. And it said no discrimination based upon race, also national origin, ethnicity. And then Southern Democrats added a poison pill, they thought, that would kill the bill. No discrimination based upon sex. But the majority of Democrats wanted that, so it passed. In the U.S. Constitution today, there's no or women do not have equal rights. But the law after the Civil Rights Act, this is where women cannot be discriminated. Yes, of course, we have it, but that's why this is such a big law. Most Republicans and all Northern Democrats voted for it. All Southern Democrats and a few Republicans. Both Montana Democrats were very liberal, including the Senate Majority Leader was Mike Mansfield of Montana. Montana used to have really powerful senators. I mean, like really powerful. Now, you know, not as. But this would split the Democrats. This would split them. And Southern Democrats begin to start looking elsewhere. And where are you going to look? That Mountain Valley. To the Republicans. That's giving a pin to Martin Luther King after those. So that's going to lead to the election of 64. Before we get to the election of 64, it's a Tonkin Gulf. The Tonkin Gulf is on there. Everyone find the Tonkin Gulf? Tonkin Gulf. Now, this is about the Vietnam War. Now, there have been a series of raids by South Vietnamese commandos against the North, trying to find a victory. The war is going horribly. A U.S. ship was actually attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats on one of these raids. This was all secret. Americans didn't know about this outside. So a second mission was sent, basically to show how tough Johnson was. And 2 American ships, that's USN ships, they claimed to be attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. And they said there were 50 torpedo boats in the water. They're firing. It's chaos. Johnson was told it's a definite attack. And he ordered a retaliation. And the U.S. bombed 3 North Vietnamese naval bases. So we're widening the war. But stop there. He showed his stuff on communism, but didn't lead to World War III. Now, do you notice I put down attack in quotes? There was no attack. The sailors were misreading radar screens. They panicked. They freaked out. Johnson was never told that they weren't sure there was an attack. Later on, Johnson would say they were shooting at a bunch of damn flying fish. But they kept that secret. The American public did not know that this attack did not happen. And so Johnson, to show he's tough, would demand, would get through Congress, a unanimous vote in the House, and only 2 senators voted against it. 2 Republican senators. Oregon. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution. And that gave the president a blank check to do anything the president wanted in South Vietnam. Anything. But it was all built on lies. And soon this will be called the credibility gap. As people begin to realize lies about how the war is going, etc. Now, Johnson didn't want war. He wanted to look tough in a presidential election. And it did work, he thought. But it's all going to be built on lies. And eventually it will come out. And this will chip away and also bitterly divide the Democrats. I don't think they've ever recovered from this. The Democrats, a combination of all these events. And that leads to Tonkin Gulf at the election in 64 then. Johnson could run under the Great Society, tough on communism, but not a lunatic. So that all fits with the Tonkin Gulf. Here's Johnson running with his running mate, Hubert Humphrey. And one more thing to add about this. The Republicans nominated the very conservative, in fact, stated conservative, Barry Goldwater, who began what's called the Southern Strategy. Now, I made a mistake on this. I should have put Southern Strategy in a different place, but if you turn it over, look at the election of 68. That's the second time the Southern Strategy would be used. To use race to divide the Democrats. First one to use it. And they vocally called conservative. It was anti-civil rights, anti-commie, and then behind the scenes, wanted to break up the New Deal. But the New Deal was really popular, so I didn't want to say it. So Goldwater really pushed this down. Look at the Civil Rights Bill. This is definitely targeting white voters. Look at it. Because of the Civil Rights Bill, a white worker is fired and a black worker is taking their job. So very much playing on racial fears. There's no hiding that. And yes, of course, Goldwater, H2O. AUH2O. And that gets to maybe the greatest television ad in history. The Daisy ad. Where Lyndon Johnson could portray himself as the moderate, as Barry Goldwater talked casually about turning North Vietnam into a glowing parking lot and dropping an atomic bomb into the bathroom of the Kremlin. And he talked a lot about World War III. In fact, the crowd would be, we don't like nuclear annihilation. Of course, whenever Goldwater would mention he's opposed to the Civil Rights Bill, they would cheer. They figured this out. So here's the ad where Johnson could play the moderate. They only broadcasted it once, but everybody remembered this. What an ad, huh? And so Johnson, the peacemaker, he's tough on communism, but not World War III. Did it work? The greatest popular vote victory in American history. Johnson won an unprecedented landslide. By the way, this would have been the time to get out of the Vietnam War. We won! I didn't put a box there, so just put it on the top. And I know there's not much room, but you're very precise. But do you see it? Goldwater's from Arizona. The South. Because of civil rights. There would be other reasons too. The South would really, in the late 70s, would really switch parties to over abortion, women's rights. Really, I mean, it's like a 180 switch. Kind of, it's coming, but we can see the elements of it here. But after the election, Johnson starts passing laws. He won this big victory, and South Vietnam nearly collapsed. Now we're coming to the Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act, at the same time, the Civil Rights Act didn't have voting rights. And so the Civil Rights Movement, the Southern Christian Leadership Committee, a few other groups, they decided to have a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, where the most segregationist governor had his capital, George Wallace. And this was to push Johnson and the Democrats for voting rights. Johnson tried to say, we got the Civil Rights Act. Give me a year. Let me get other bills. Let me win in Vietnam. And they said, no. Well, on this march, this is actually the second march, but on the march, protesters met him, and then they would be attacked by the state police of Alabama. And this was all on television. And Lyndon Johnson got act. They're making great courage to make Johnson push for what he promised for. And he did. He proposed it, made a speech on national TV, demanding voting rights. By the way, when he got off the stage, Johnson looked to one of his closest advisors, Bill Moyers, and said, you know, we just lost the Democratic Party in the South. All start voting Republican. And he would turn out to be not quite clairvoyant. It's going to be 60 years right now. And with that, and so what did he do? Well, he couldn't lose in Vietnam. And so he decided, I would escalate. he started to bomb North Vietnam. And then they really started bombing South guerrilla bases. And then, well, if you have air bases, you got to send the Marines to protect them. So they sent in the Marines. They actually landed on beaches like they were landing on Iwo Jima in World War II, even though there was no opposition. This were the TV cameras. Well, when the Marines got there, the Viet Cong started lobbing mortar shells at them. So they wanted to go out and get them. And now Johnson's got a point. He proposes the Voting Rights Act. He thinks, I need to look tough on Vietnam or I won't get voting rights. I won't get the Great Society. All of his advisors say, you know, we can win in Vietnam. We'll push back enough, we'll win and get South Vietnam. He doesn't want the war, but feels he has no choice. And so in June of 65, he escalates. He commits ground forces. Justification, Tonkin Gulf. So he doesn't have to go to Congress to ask for war. Here he is in Vietnam pinning a medal on, that's 82nd Airborne Division. Eventually, over 500,000 American troops are going to be there. None of our allies join up. None of our allies outside of Southeast Asia. France thought we were insane. Why did he do it? To save the Great Society. Also, JFK made it important. JFK was assassinated. He felt he had to do it. And alliances. And we got the domino theory. He felt he had to. But the whole thing is going to be built on lies. He tried to hide the escalation. He tried to shelter the public so to make it as less intrusive as possible. And it's going to blow up in his face. He's going to pass more laws than any president in history. It's hard to find a more powerful president than Lyndon Johnson overall. He's going to win the biggest popular vote victory in American history. Remember, that doesn't matter, but still. And in 1968, he's going to drop out of the election. That's how divisive it's going to be. Did it work? It seemed to. 3 big bills were passed. Medicare. Okay, he couldn't go all the way with the New Deal, what FDR and then Truman wanted, but this would provide health insurance for the elderly. Kicks in at 65. And you want to find something that's popular, it's Medicare. As I get older, I really know about Medicare. This combines with Social Security. Medicaid would be help for people with lower incomes health care. But it's every state has a different program. So Montana's Medicare is relatively limited. Like Texas, it's really limited for the poor. Places like Illinois, it's much broader. And then the Voting Rights Act passed. And this ended voter discrimination. No more literacy tests, no more different ballots, trying to discourage African Americans or also American Indians, Hispanic Americans who have been routinely denied the right to vote, or poor people in general. But in 2012, most of this would be thrown out by the Supreme Court, who announced that racism was over. That was literally in the rule. Now you could say racism is over or not, but that's what they ruled. And that's when these things started to come back. Here's him signing Medicare. Here's him after the Voting Rights Act. Yeah. Throughout the Voting Rights Act.
And the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So they said that the measures that the Justice Department used to end voter discrimination were not necessary. So that's where you start getting all these voter ID laws, redistricting, like that. That would have been illegal under the Voting Rights Act, but they're no longer illegal because they would have been said to be voter discrimination, but that no longer exists, according to the Supreme Court. And so Vietnam, 500,000 troops by 67. I'm not going to go into the details of the war here, so don't worry about that right now. The United States thought we would win because we had helicopters. This turned into a horrible, bloody guerrilla war. By Now, by 1968, there's going to be 28,000 American casualties. I'm sorry, American deaths, and over 1 million South Vietnamese. And it's only going to get bloodier in South Vietnam. The Viet Cong, they never really lost. North Vietnam just matched our escalation. Well, we're going to jump. We're going to right to this. Oh, I didn't quite get enough time. Oh, this is when in 1968, also in Sweden, they decided to make red lights. They switched reverse red light and green light. See, red light meant go and green light meant stop. To see a sociological experiment in Stockholm. Worked really well. I don't know. It's Swedish. Homer traffic and log lagging. Okay. Okay, so my plan is for tomorrow. Let me finish this out a little bit. My plan is tomorrow, though. I'm gonna do a few of this, and then we'll get half period to do a practice. Sound good? So really quickly, we already talked about the feminine mystique. Let me do this last bit. Oh, the bell guard. Yeah. So last few things here. I'll fill in a few blanks here and there, the best I can, and go from there. Oh, by the way, I will review with everything at lunch, or the last page. I'll finish up the last page at lunch. That is also due. So any questions, I'll answer that. And then, oh, those of you who were at lunch yesterday, you know I answered a lot. If you didn't show up, you'll do. So please grade them. I want to know how you did. Yeah. If you have that, you know about that. Huh? Or good job. All right.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow. See you. Okay, so I will go to the last page or anything else tomorrow or today at lunch again. You didn't go. Covered a lot.